There was a man named Tom who worked in a repair shop on an asteroid. This wasn't the kind of life that made people famous or rich, and Tom didn't care about that one bit. He was happy fixing things. Every day he would come into his shop, surrounded by broken machines and tangled wires, and he would spend his time making them work again. It was simple, honest work, and it made him feel like he was doing something real. Tom's father, Jack, had owned this shop before him. Jack was the kind of man who treated everyone the same way, whether they were human or something completely different. When aliens came to the asteroid colony 5 years ago, most people in the settlement were terrified. These creatures, called the Veldar, were massive beings that looked like dragons from old stories. They stood 3 meters tall, with skin covered in scales that glowed different colors depending on their mood. Their eyes were intelligent and calculating, and when they moved you could feel the power in their bodies. But Jack wasn't afraid. He saw the Veldar as customers, as beings who had broken things that needed fixing, just like his human clients. He would walk into their spacecraft without hesitation, shake their large hands with respect, and get to work on whatever needed repair. The Veldar noticed this. They noticed that Jack didn't act scared or treat them like monsters. They respected him for it. Jack made good money from this work, but more importantly he showed his son something valuable, that you could treat anyone with dignity and they would treat you with dignity in return. When Jack died, Tom took over the shop. He didn't become famous for it, and nobody threw a celebration for him. He simply opened the doors, fixed the machines, and treated everyone the same way his father had. This is how life went for Tom, day after day, month after month. He would wake up, go to work, fix broken equipment, and come home tired but satisfied that he had done something useful. One evening, Tom was working on a repair job deep inside the docking bay. The work was complicated, something about a cooling system that wasn't working right. His hands were covered in grease and he was focused on the task in front of him. That's when he heard something that made him stop and listen carefully. It was a sound, far away, that didn't belong in a mechanical repair facility. It was singing, but not happy singing. This was the kind of sound that carries sadness, the kind of sound people make when something important has been lost. Tom put down his tools and followed the sound. He moved through the bay, past rows of equipment and storage containers, until he came to a small, quiet section that most workers never went to. What he found there changed the direction of his entire life, though he didn't know it at the time. There were 3 young Veldar creatures standing in a circle, and in the middle of that circle was a 4th one that wasn't moving. This smaller creature lay completely still, and the 3 others around it were making those sounds Tom had heard, a deep, mournful singing that seemed to come from their bodies like it was part of them. They were grieving. Tom understood this immediately, even though he had never seen Veldar grieve before. One of the young creatures noticed Tom standing there. It made a hissing sound and moved toward him in a way that could have been threatening. Tom's heart started beating faster, but he didn't run. Instead, he did what his father would have done. He held up his hands to show he wasn't carrying any weapons, and he kept his voice calm and low. "Hey," Tom said, speaking slowly and clearly. "It's okay. I'm just the repair person. I'm not here to hurt anything. I just heard something and came to check." The young Veldar still seemed tense, but it didn't attack. The 3 creatures went back to their singing and Tom stood there listening. He realized they were singing for their friend, the one that wasn't moving. They were singing a goodbye song, something beautiful and sad all at once. Tom didn't think about what he was doing next. He just opened his mouth and started to hum. The melody that came out was something his mother, Beth, used to sing to him when he was very small and couldn't sleep. It was a gentle tune, the kind that makes you feel safe and protected. It was a lullaby, a song that his mother had taught him meant everything would be okay, even when things seemed scary. When the Veldar heard Tom's voice, something strange happened. They stopped their singing and just listened. Tom kept humming, pouring his own sadness into the melody, thinking about his father and all the people he had lost. The 3 young Veldar listened to his human voice mixing with their ancient grief, and then something magical occurred. They started singing again, but this time they wove Tom's melody into their own song. The human lullaby and the alien funeral song became one thing, neither completely human nor completely Veldar, but something new that belonged to both. When the song finally ended, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the smallest Veldar, the one that had been lying completely still, opened its eyes. Its scales began to glow with colors Tom had never seen on any creature before. Deep purple light mixed with silver, creating patterns that seemed to flow across its body like water. The creature looked directly at Tom, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither of them fully understood. Tom didn't know that his simple act of kindness, his instinct to respond to sadness with a gentle song, had just set into motion events that would change everything. He didn't know that his voice carried something ancient and powerful, something that the Veldar had been waiting for across 300 years of their history. He was just a mechanic, covered in grease, who had tried to comfort something that was hurting. But that simple human act of compassion would echo across an entire galaxy. Tom didn't plan to go back to that quiet section of the docking bay the next evening, but he found himself there anyway. It was like his feet knew where to go before his mind had made the decision. He brought a small music player with him, one that his mother had given him years ago, filled with old songs from Earth. He wasn't sure why he thought he might need it, but something inside him whispered that he should. The young Veldar was still there, the small one with the purple and silver scales. It was still not moving much, still struggling with whatever injury or sickness had laid it low. But when Tom entered the bay, he could see something different in the creature's eyes. There was awareness there now and what looked like hope. The three other juveniles who had been singing the funeral dirge were still keeping vigil, never leaving their friend's side. Tom sat down on a metal crate near the injured creature and began to sing. This time he wasn't humming quietly. He sang the words to Brahms' Lullaby, an old German song that had been sung to mothers and fathers, to children and grandchildren for hundreds of years. His voice wasn't perfect. He wasn't a trained singer, and he would have admitted to anyone that he wasn't particularly good at it. But something about his voice, something about the fact that it was genuine and came from a real person who cared, seemed to matter more than technical skill. As Tom sang, he watched the injured Veldar. The creature's scales, which had been dull and lifeless, began to glow softly. Its breathing seemed to become easier. The three young creatures around it pressed closer, as if the song was healing them too, as if the simple act of hearing a voice sing with compassion could repair something broken deep inside their bodies and spirits. Night after night, Tom returned. He became a regular visitor to that bay. The other workers noticed him going there but said nothing. Tom sang every song he could remember from his childhood. He sang "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," the song his mother used to sing while pointing at the actual stars outside their apartment window on Earth. He sang old work songs that his father, Jack, had taught him, songs that people used to sing while building things and fixing things and working hard together. Each song seemed to help the injured creature heal a little bit more. What surprised Tom most was that more young Veldar began to appear. Every evening, there would be a few more of them in that quiet section of the bay. Some had injuries you could see, scars on their scales, burns from weapons, damage to their limbs. Others seemed fine on the outside but carried wounds you couldn't see, damage to their minds and spirits from the harsh training that the Veldar military put their young warriors through. Tom learned that the Veldar raised their young to be soldiers from a very early age, teaching them to fight and kill but somehow forgetting to teach them how to feel, how to grieve, how to be anything other than weapons. These broken young creatures would sit and listen to Tom sing. Sometimes they would try to hum along, their alien voices creating harmonies with his human melody. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, their scales glowing gently as they absorbed something they desperately needed. Tom realized without anyone telling him, that these young Veldar were starving for something. They were starving for gentleness, for beauty, for proof that the galaxy contained things other than pain and duty and endless training. Then one evening, everything changed. Tom was in the middle of singing an old work song when the air seemed to shift. The temperature felt different and all the young Veldar suddenly went very still and quiet. Tom looked up from his singing and felt his stomach drop. Standing at the entrance to the bay was an enormous Vel, easily the largest creature Tom had ever seen. This being was covered in scars. Not new scars but old ones, marks that spoke of 100 different battles and conflicts. The creature's scales were dark, almost black, but shot through with threads of silver light that seemed to pulse with power. Tom's hands went cold. He recognized this being immediately, not from meeting it before but from the way everyone in the colony talked about it. This was Commander Thelkor, the supreme leader of all the Veldar forces in this part of space. This was a creature that had conquered worlds and defeated enemies that made other people's nightmares seem harmless. Tom stopped singing. His throat went dry. He thought about running, about apologizing, about explaining that he was just trying to help. He thought about everything his father had taught him about treating people with respect, but this was different. This wasn't just another customer in the repair shop. This was power incarnate, walking toward him in the form of a dragon-like alien. But Commander Thelkor didn't attack. The great creature simply stood there and watched. It watched Tom with eyes that seemed ancient and wise, eyes that had seen things that human minds couldn't even imagine. Thelkor watched as Tom nervously finished the song, his voice shaking slightly but still continuing because his father had taught him to see things through once you had started them. When the last note faded away, the commander stepped forward. His scales began to flicker with patterns and colors that Tom's translator couldn't keep up with. The patterns were so complex, so layered with meaning, that the small device on Tom's wrist just made confused beeping sounds. Then Thelcor spoke, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep and resonant and carrying the weight of ages. "The prophecy," the commander said slowly, each word seeming to carry enormous significance. "The voice that unites the broken pieces and heals what has been fractured. We have been waiting for this voice across 300 cycles of our civilization. We have waited so long that many of us stopped believing it would ever come." Tom stood there, covered in grease from his day's work, holding his small music player, completely confused about what the most powerful alien commander in the region was talking about. Over the next few weeks, Tom's life became very strange. Commander Thelcor began visiting him regularly, which was something that nobody in the colony had ever experienced before. The most powerful military leader in the entire region would come to Tom's small repair shop, this humble place filled with broken machinery and tools, and sit there talking to a human mechanic about things that sounded impossible. It started with Thelcor asking questions. The commander wanted to know everything about Tom, where he came from, what his family was like, why he chose to work as a mechanic, what songs his mother had taught him. Tom answered honestly, not really understanding why any of this mattered. He told Thelcor about his father Jack, and how Jack had taught him to treat all beings with respect. He talked about his mother, Beth, and how she had sung to him when he was small. He explained that he wasn't special, that he was just a regular person who fixed things for a living. Thelcor listened to all of this very carefully. Then the commander began to explain something that made Tom's head spin. The Veldar, Thelcor explained, were not a young species. They had existed for thousands and thousands of years. During all that time, they had developed a civilization based on something very unusual. They were fundamentally a species of music and sound. To a Veldar, music wasn't just entertainment or something nice to have. It was the foundation of everything they were. Sound and vibration were woven into their biology, into how they thought, how they healed, how they bonded with each other. Thousands of years ago, when the Veldar civilization was going through a terrible crisis, an ancient oracle, a wise being who could see into possible futures, had made a prophecy. This oracle had spoken of a time when the Veldar would become fractured and broken, when their society would be in danger of tearing itself apart. During that dark time, the oracle said, a voice would come. This voice would not be a Veldar voice. It would be different, strange, coming from outside their civilization. But this voice would carry a kind of power that nothing else could, a power to heal what had been broken, to bring together what had been separated. The prophecy had been written down and passed through generations of Veldar leaders. But for a long time, nobody really believed it would happen. It seemed like just a story, something nice to think about but probably not real. Then things started to go wrong. The Veldar military training had become increasingly harsh and brutal. The military leaders believed that to create the perfect soldiers, they needed to train young Veldar to be nothing but warriors. So they created training programs that pushed the young creatures to the edge of death, over and over again. They taught young Veldar to ignore pain, to suppress emotions, to see everything as either an enemy to be defeated or irrelevant. The problem was that this training was working too well. The young Veldar were becoming perfect soldiers, it was true. But they were becoming nothing else. They were losing the ability to feel joy. They couldn't create art anymore. They couldn't bond with each other in normal, healthy ways. They couldn't find meaning in anything except combat and duty. Within a decade, maybe less, the Veldar would have an army of perfect killing machines with nothing left to defend. No culture, no art, no love, no reason to even exist beyond warfare. It was an existential crisis. The entire species was at risk of becoming hollow from the inside out. Thelcor sat in Tom's repair shop one evening, his massive frame somehow squeezed into the space designed for human-sized beings, and he explained all of this. The commander's voice was heavy with sadness as he talked about what was happening to his people. You must understand what we are, Thelcor said, his scales rippling with colors that reflected his emotion. The Veldar are a species made of music. Sound and vibration are not just something we enjoy or use for communication. They are part of our physical bodies, part of how our brains work, part of the very foundation of what makes us alive. Tom listened, trying to understand but feeling very confused and very small. Your melodies, Thelcor continued, they do something that nothing else can do. When you sing, it bypasses all the layers of training and conditioning that we have built around our young warriors. Your voice reaches something deeper, something more fundamental. It reaches the part of us that is pure and authentic before all the military training, before all the hardening that we do. It touches the core beneath the armor. Tom wanted to interrupt and say that he was just a mechanic, that he wasn't qualified for any of this, that this was all some kind of mistake. But something in Thelkor's expression made him stay quiet and listen. "There is something you need to know," the commander said, and now his voice was very serious. "We believe you are the one the prophecy spoke of. The voice that will heal the fractured pieces. The voice that will save our civilization." Tom felt something heavy settling on his shoulders. It was like someone had just put the weight of an entire world on him. He wanted to run away from this responsibility. He wanted to go back to being just a mechanic, fixing machines and not having to think about prophecies or civilizations or anything bigger than his next repair job. "I'm just a mechanic," Tom protested, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "I didn't choose any of this. I was just trying to help some injured creatures. I didn't know there was some ancient prophecy. I'm not special. I'm nobody." Thelkor's expression became almost gentle, which was strange to see on the face of such a powerful and fearsome creature. "That is precisely why you are the one," the commander said quietly. "The prophecy specified very clearly that the voice would not seek power. It would not come from someone ambitious or trying to become important. It would come from someone humble, someone from ordinary circumstances, someone who was just doing what they thought was right without expecting anything in return. You are exactly what was predicted thousands of years ago." The commander's scales rippled again, but this time with sadness so profound that Tom could feel it in his chest. "There is a summit beginning in 14 days, Thelkor said. "Leaders from all the different Veldar territories will gather to make decisions about the future of our species. Both the military faction and the civilian faction are preparing for civil war. They cannot agree on what to do. Some want to make the warrior training even more brutal, believing that pure military might is the only thing that matters. Others want to reform the system, to preserve art and culture and the ability to feel. They are on the brink of destroying each other." Thelkor stood up, his massive form unfolding from the space that was far too small for him. "You will attend this summit," the commander said. "You will do what you have already been doing. You will sing. You will sing the way you sang for Starborn and the others. Just be yourself. Let your voice carry what it naturally carries. That is all we need. That is all the prophecy requires." The journey to Veldar Central Command took 3 days. Tom traveled on a Veldar spacecraft, which was an experience that made everything in his life before seem small and ordinary. The ship moved through space in ways that defied his understanding of physics. Windows showed him stars that he had never seen before, planets spinning in the darkness, and cosmic phenomena that made him realize just how vast the universe really was. When the ship finally landed, Tom was taken to a facility that left him speechless. The great amphitheater at Veldar Central Command had been carved from a single massive asteroid. It was so large that it could hold hundreds of beings comfortably. The walls were polished to a mirror shine, and embedded throughout the structure were strange devices that Commander Thelkor explained were called harmonic resonators. These devices could capture sound waves and transform them into visible light and color patterns, making music something that you could literally see. Before Tom arrived at the summit, he had received help from people in the colony. A woman named Jennifer who worked in the diplomatic corps had spent hours with him, coaching him on what to expect. She had taught him how to breathe when he was nervous, how to focus his mind when everything felt overwhelming. She had told him that the Veldar were not monsters, that they were beings who felt emotion just like humans did, and that the most important thing he could do was remain calm and be himself. His best friend, William, had come to say goodbye before Tom left for the summit. William had known Tom since they were both young back on Earth. William had told him that no matter what happened, Tom should remember who he was, just a regular person trying to do the right thing. That simple reminder meant more to Tom than all of Jennifer's coaching. Now Tom stood in the center of the amphitheater and he felt very, very small. The space above him rose in tiers and on each tier sat Veldar. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They filled the entire structure, their scales glowing in different colors, creating a living rainbow of light. The colors weren't random. Tom learned quickly that they represented different things. Some Veldar had scales that glowed in deep reds and oranges, aggressive colors that seemed to speak of warrior intensity. Others had scales that shimmered in softer blues and greens, colors that seemed thoughtful and philosophical. A few had scales that shifted between multiple colors, as if they couldn't decide which faction they belonged to. The clothes that had been provided for Tom were made of a silver and blue material that felt strange against his skin. The colors had been chosen deliberately to complement the Veldar aesthetic, to make him look less out of place in this alien environment. But nothing could really make a human mechanic look like he belonged in this ancient amphitheater surrounded by hundreds of dragon-like aliens. The debates had been going on for hours before Tom was brought forward. He had listened to them from a waiting chamber, trying to understand the arguments being made. Military strategists presented plans for consolidating the warrior caste, making it even more unified, even more powerful, even more focused on pure combat efficiency. They showed data and projections, arguing that external threats to Veldar civilization required absolute military readiness. They spoke passionately about duty and strength and the glory of being the perfect soldier. Then civilian philosophers would stand and counter these arguments. They presented their own data showing that throughout history, civilizations that focused only on warfare eventually collapsed. They talked about cultures that had lost art and music and creativity, and how those cultures had become hollow inside, how their people had lost the will to even continue living. They argued that what the Veldar needed wasn't more warriors, they needed to remember why they were fighting in the first place. But neither side would give in. Neither side would accept even a small compromise. The debate grew more heated as time passed. Voices rose. Scales flickered with angry colors. Tom could feel the tension building in the amphitheater, like a storm that was about to break. Then Thelcor stood and called Tom forward. The moment Tom stepped into the center of the amphitheater floor, everything went silent. Every single Veldar eye turned toward him. He was completely alone in that vast space, with hundreds of alien creatures staring at him, waiting to see what he would do. Tom's heart was pounding so hard that he thought the entire amphitheater could probably hear it. His palms were sweating. His mouth felt dry. He wanted to run away. He wanted to explain that this was all a mistake, that he couldn't possibly do what everyone expected him to do. Then he thought about Starborn, the small Veldar with the purple and silver scales who had opened its eyes and seemed to come back to life when Tom sang. He thought about all the other young Veldar he had sung to, all of them broken and hurting and desperate for something that the rigid military system couldn't provide. He thought about his father, Jack, who had taught him to see the dignity in every being. He thought about his mother, Beth, singing lullabies to him when he was small and afraid of the dark. Tom opened his mouth and began to sing. The song he chose was Hush, Little Child, an old lullaby about protection and safety, about a world where things could be fixed, where wounds could be gently healed, where violence wasn't necessary. His voice wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was genuine. It carried real emotion, real feeling, real care. As his voice filled the amphitheater, something extraordinary happened. The harmonic resonators embedded in the walls began to glow. They captured his sound waves and transformed them into visible light patterns. Colors bloomed in the air around him, soft blues and gentle golds and silvers that seemed to float like living things. The patterns weren't random. They seemed to express emotion themselves, showing sorrow and compassion and complete sincerity. Tom's human voice, imperfect and fragile in this vast alien space, created something that transcended both species. The light patterns seemed to reach into the hearts of every Veldar in the amphitheater. The military strategists whose scales had been burning with red and orange aggression began to cool, shifting toward blues and purples. The civilian philosophers whose scales had been sharp and angular began to soften. As Tom reached the final notes of the lullaby, tears began to stream down his face. He wasn't acting this emotion, it was completely real. He was crying for the Veldar civilization that stood on the brink of destroying itself. He was crying for the young warriors who had been trained to be nothing but killing machines. He was crying for the beauty and art and music that might be lost forever if this conflict continued. Then something magical happened. The young Veldar in the amphitheater, the ones Tom had been singing to in the repair bay, began to hum. They hummed the melody that Tom was singing, adding their own voices to his. But they didn't just repeat his song. They wove it with their own Veldar harmonics, creating something that was neither purely human nor purely alien, but something entirely new. Something that belonged to both species at once. The humming spread like wildfire through the amphitheater. More and more Veldar joined in. Even some of the hardline military strategists, the ones who had argued most passionately for consolidating the warrior caste, began to hum along. Their scales, which had been burning with aggressive colors, began to shift and change. The colors became softer, more thoughtful, more open to the possibility of something different. By the time the final note faded away, nearly every Veldar in the amphitheater was participating in the melody. The harmonic resonators created light patterns so beautiful and complex that Tom had to shield his eyes. The combined sound of hundreds of Veldar voices, all singing together with one human voice, created something that was almost too powerful to bear. Tom stood there, alone in the center of the amphitheater, and realized that something fundamental had just changed. The prophecy, whatever it really meant, had been fulfilled. Not through power or force or politics, but through the simple act of one person choosing to share their voice, their compassion, and their genuine care for beings that most of his species feared. After the summit, nothing happened immediately. Tom had half expected that everything would change overnight, that the Veldar would suddenly abandon their military ways and become a civilization devoted entirely to art and music. But that wasn't how real change worked. Real change happened slowly, one decision at a time, one person at a time, often in ways that nobody noticed until you looked back and realized how far you had come. Over the following months, Tom watched as the Veldar began the difficult process of transforming their society. It wasn't easy. The military faction didn't simply accept defeat and fade away. There were disagreements and arguments and moments when it seemed like the whole thing might fall apart. But something had shifted in the amphitheater that day, something fundamental that made both sides willing to try something different. The first major change came when Commander Thelkor announced new military doctrine. The warrior training would continue. The Veldar still needed soldiers, still needed to defend themselves against external threats. But the training would be reformed. Young Veldar would still learn to fight, would still develop the strength and discipline that warriors needed. But now they would also be required to study music and art and creative expression. This was revolutionary for the Veldar military. For generations they had separated these things completely. Warriors trained in combat. Artists and musicians were separate from the military structure. But Thelkor's new doctrine insisted that the two should be integrated. A true warrior, the commander declared, was not just someone who could fight. A true warrior was someone who understood the things they were fighting to protect. The brutal neural protocols that had been used to suppress emotion in young Veldar were modified. They weren't completely eliminated. The Veldar still needed discipline and focus, but they were changed. The modifications preserved the psychological functions that made a being fully alive. Young Veldar could still become excellent soldiers, but they wouldn't lose their ability to feel joy or create art or bond with others in healthy ways. Training academies were restructured. Military instructors were joined by artists and musicians. Combat training was balanced with musical instruction. Young Veldar would spend part of their day learning weapons and tactics, and part of their day learning to sing and compose and express themselves through art. Some of the young warriors resisted this at first, seeing it as a waste of time. But gradually they began to understand. The music made them better warriors. Understanding beauty and creativity made them more thoughtful about when and how violence should be used. It wasn't everything that the civilian philosophers had wanted. They had hoped for a more dramatic rejection of military values. But it also wasn't what the military strategists had wanted. They had fought hard to preserve the pure warrior culture. What emerged was something in between, something that both sides could eventually accept. It was harmony rather than conflict. Tom, meanwhile, became something he had never wanted to be: important. The news of the summit spread quickly throughout the galaxy. Other species heard about how a human mechanic had prevented a civil war among the Veldar, how his voice had carried something that transcended both species. Offers came from everywhere. Governments wanted him to serve as a diplomat. Universities wanted him to teach. Military organizations wanted to study his voice and understand how it worked. Musicians wanted him to perform in concert halls. Politicians wanted him to appear at events and give speeches. Tom turned down almost every offer. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be treated as special or important or anything other than what he had always been: a mechanic who fixed broken things. He went back to his repair shop on Kepler Station and returned to his regular life. He fixed machines during the day. He went home to a small apartment in the evening. He lived quietly and tried to ignore the fact that people now recognized him when he walked through the colony. But there was one offer that Tom accepted. He agreed to mentor young Veldar who wanted to learn about human music and Earth culture. Starbound was first, of course. The small Veldar with the purple and silver scales had recovered completely from its injuries. The neural pathways that had been damaged were now healthy and functioning normally. But Starbound had developed a deep passion for music, inspired by the lullabies that had healed it. Starbound began visiting Tom's repair shop regularly. The young Veldar would sit in the small space, this massive alien creature somehow fitting itself into surroundings designed for humans, and Tom would teach it songs. He taught Starbound Brahms' Lullaby, and Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, and old work songs and everything else he could remember from his mother's collection. More importantly, he encouraged Starbound to compose original music, to take the Earth melodies and blend them with Veldar harmonics to create something new. Other young Veldar followed. Some were military trainees seeking to understand this new integration of music and combat. Others were simply curious beings who had heard that the human mechanic could teach them something valuable. Tom's repair shop became an informal school where Veldar youth learned Earth songs and human history and the stories behind the melodies. The shop was never quiet anymore. It was filled with the sounds of human and alien voices learning to blend together. One evening, as the sun was setting over the asteroid colony, Thelkor visited Tom's shop for one of his rare personal visits. The great commander had to carefully fold his massive frame to fit inside the human-scaled space, but he seemed content to sit there among the young Veldar students and the scattered tools of the repair trade. "You saved more than just us," Thelkor said quietly, his scales glowing softly in the evening light. "You understand that, don't you? The prophecy was never just about the Veldar civilization. It was about demonstrating something to the entire galaxy. It was about showing that healing is possible, that the fractures between different species can be repaired, that understanding and compassion can bridge differences that seem impossible to overcome." Tom set down the tools he had been working with. He felt uncomfortable being praised, uncomfortable being told that he had done something important. "I just sing," Tom said simply. "That's all I've ever done." "Exactly," Thelkor replied, and his mandibles curved in what Tom had learned to recognize as a genuine smile. "Through that simple act you changed everything. The broken things that you fix are not always mechanisms and circuits. Sometimes they are species. Sometimes they are entire civilizations. Sometimes they are futures that could have been terrible, and through your voice and your compassion, you transformed them into something beautiful instead." Tom looked out the viewport of his repair shop. Stars shone in the darkness of space, and he could see the ships coming and going from Kepler Station. News of the Veldar transformation was spreading throughout the galaxy. Other species that had been locked in conflict were beginning to wonder if perhaps their own struggles could be healed in unexpected ways. If a human mechanic could reach the hearts of warrior dragons through simple lullabies, what else might be possible? Tom returned to his work, fixing broken machines and teaching young Veldar to sing. Somewhere in the asteroid colony, Starborn was teaching the lullabies to other young warriors, spreading the melody forward into an uncertain future. The prophecy had not ended, it was only beginning. It was spreading outward like ripples on water, touching more and more beings, slowly transforming the galaxy in ways that nobody could have predicted. The broken things were being fixed. The fractured pieces were being brought back together. And it was happening not through force or power or political maneuvering, but through the simple human act of singing to those who were hurting and showing them that they were not alone. Tom understood now that his father, Jack, had been teaching him this lesson all along. You could change the world by treating everyone with dignity and compassion, by seeing their worth even when they seemed dangerous or different or impossible to understand. Tom was just a mechanic. But through his voice and his care and his willingness to see the good in every being, he had become something more. A bridge between worlds, a healer of ancient rifts, a living embodiment of a prophecy that said healing was possible if you were willing to listen, to care, and to share your voice with those who desperately needed to hear it.